The call was made from inside a federal jail, not a phone smuggled through a crack in the wall, not a contraband cell hidden in a mattress. A regular phone, the kind the federal government installed on the floor of the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Chicago for inmates to use legally, with their names attached, their PIN numbers logged, their conversations monitored by the same federal agents who put them there in the first place. Roosevelt Daniels picked up that phone and allegedly kept running his cocaine operation anyway. According to investigators, he wasn't panicking behind those walls. He wasn't scrambling to pass a message or desperately trying to stay relevant while his people figured out life without him. According to the FBI, he was conducting business, orders were allegedly being relayed, associates on the outside were allegedly receiving instructions. And one person in that network was allegedly helping route three-way calls so that Daniels could hold conversations that reached far beyond the walls of that building, past the armed officers, past the steel doors, past every layer of federal custody designed to contain exactly this kind of person. That detail right there, that one phone call allegation, is what separates Roosevelt Daniels from dozens of other Chicago drug figures who got arrested, processed, convicted, and forgotten. Most men in his position, once those handcuffs clicked shut, the organization fell apart, the money stopped. The workers scattered, the streets found somebody new to follow. That's the natural order of things. Arrest the man at the top, and the whole structure beneath him collapses because it was held together by his presence. But federal prosecutors didn't believe that's what happened here. They believed the structure held. They believed the money kept moving. They believed that somewhere between the locked doors and the monitored phone lines and the armed guards, Roosevelt Daniels had built something disciplined enough, deep enough, and loyal enough to keep functioning even after its alleged architect was in federal custody. And if those allegations are true, if that organization really did keep breathing after his arrest, then the question you have to ask is the same one federal investigators spent years trying to answer. How does someone build that? Chicago in the late 1970s was changing faster than anyone could explain and faster than anyone wanted to admit. The manufacturing economy that had built entire neighborhoods on the south and west sides, the one that gave working families stable wages and something that looked like a future, was quietly being dismantled, factories closed, jobs that had been there for 30 years disappeared in a single season. Fathers who had worked the same plant since before their children were born came home one afternoon to find the gates locked. And the neighborhoods those families had spent generations building, maintaining, investing in, raising kids in, began to fray at the edges in ways that don't show up in a single news story. They show up slowly, in rising vacancy rates, in corner stores closing, in a particular kind of quiet that settles over a block when hope stops circulating. Nature doesn't tolerate a vacuum, neither do the streets. What the legitimate economy abandoned, the drug economy claimed. First marijuana, then heroin. Then, in the early 1980s, cocaine arrived in Chicago the same way it arrived everywhere, expensive at first, exclusive, a status symbol for people with money. And then crack happened, and the price dropped, and the market exploded, and entire neighborhoods that were already struggling found themselves facing something new and devastating on top of everything else. For some people growing up in that environment during that period, the street economy wasn't a choice made from some position of comfort. It was what was in front of them. It was where the money was, where the structure was, where you could build something that resembled power in a world that had made legitimate power feel permanently out of reach. According to federal prosecutors, Roosevelt Daniels understood that environment deeply, not just as someone who participated in it, but as someone who allegedly studied it, organized around it, and built something within it that outlasted every police pressure, every rival, organization every attempt to knock it down. The federal case against him would eventually describe a man who didn't think like a street dealer. The indictment didn't accuse him of standing on a corner. It accused him of allegedly directing a large-scale cocaine distribution conspiracy, the kind of operation that required multiple trusted associates, organized roles, and communication systems designed to keep the top insulated from the bottom. That distinction matters because it explains why this case became a landmark. By the mid-1980s, federal investigators had built a picture of what they believed was happening inside Chicago's cocaine trade. And in that picture, Roosevelt Daniels occupied a position that wasn't about moving a few kilos. It was about allegedly overseeing a network that moved cocaine across multiple neighborhoods with the kind of consistency and discipline that you can't maintain through intimidation alone. You can scare someone into keeping their mouth shut once. You can threaten someone into doing their job one time. But you can't build a long-running criminal enterprise on fear alone, because fear is exhausting, and exhausted people make mistakes. And mistakes is exactly what federal investigators needed to start connecting threads. What federal agents alleged they found instead was an organization where people knew their roles, maintained their lanes, and reportedly kept functioning even under law enforcement pressure. Some people moved the product, some collected money, some never touched drugs at all. They were just part of the communication layer, the buffer between the operation and anyone who might be watching. The investigation moved the way federal investigations always do, not fast and not in a straight line. Investigators collected names, cross-referenced them with phone records, built surveillance, followed financial trails that looked like nothing until you put them next to the right name on the right document. Connected people who believed they had never been connected. The indictment that eventually came down accused Daniels and several co-defendants of conspiracy to distribute cocaine distribution offenses using telephones to facilitate the narcotics business, and racketeering-related charges. It wasn't a simple case. It was the kind of prosecution that takes years to build because you're not trying to prove one transaction. You're trying to prove an entire criminal structure existed and that the man at the top of that structure was directing it. Then came the arrest, and then came something federal agents did not expect. When Roosevelt Daniels went into federal custody at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Chicago, the natural assumption inside the government was that the investigation's hardest work was behind them. They had their target. He was locked up. The organization, whatever remained of it, would either scatter or collapse without his leadership. But according to court filings, that's not what the FBI observed. What they observed, or believed they observed, was that the phone calls didn't stop. The FBI obtained court authorization to monitor telephones on Daniels' floor inside the MCC. What they allegedly captured on those recordings was striking. Daniels using the jail's own legal phone system to allegedly continue conducting narcotics business, and not just in a general, supervisory way. According to investigators, there was an associate on the outside helping to facilitate three-way calls, conversations that allowed Daniels to connect with members of the network who were still operating in Chicago streets. Sit with that for a second. This was not a man who believed he was being watched making vague references to business. This was allegedly a man who was so confident in his organization, or so certain he was untouchable, that he continued allegedly directing it from inside one of the most monitored environments in the federal system. Every call logged, every conversation documented. The same phone records that were supposed to just track compliance were building the government's case in real time. Each intercepted conversation became another piece of evidence. Each call became another thread. And as those threads multiplied, investigators began connecting them to people on the outside, associates who didn't yet know their conversations were being documented, who didn't yet know that voice they were receiving instructions from was also the voice the FBI was listening to. There's something almost surreal about that dynamic when you sit with it. The MCC wasn't a county lockup. It was a federal detention facility in downtown Chicago, designed specifically to hold high-profile defendants, people the government considered dangerous enough to need serious containment. The phone system on Daniels' floor wasn't unmonitored. It was never unmonitored. The PIN numbers, the call logs, the recordings, all of it existed precisely because the federal government anticipated that people like Roosevelt Daniels would try to use those phones for purposes beyond calling their families. The monitoring wasn't a surprise enforcement move. It was standard procedure for that environment. And yet, according to investigators, the calls kept coming. That either means Daniels was so committed to keeping his organization running that he accepted the surveillance risk as the cost of doing business, or it means he believed on some level that what he had built was so tight, so insulated, so far removed from anything an FBI agent could directly connect to his voice on a phone recording, that the monitoring didn't matter, that even if they heard everything, they couldn't prove enough. If that was the calculation, the federal courts eventually ruled it was wrong. Search warrants followed, more arrests came, the case expanded. And what had started as an investigation into Roosevelt Daniels individually became a federal prosecution involving multiple defendants, built in significant part on evidence that Daniels himself had allegedly generated by making phone calls from his jail cell. That is one of the most remarkable things about this entire case. The investigation's most damaging evidence allegedly came after the arrest, because according to the government, Daniels didn't stop. For federal prosecutors, that wasn't just proof that the operation existed. It was proof of something more consequential, that removing the alleged leader from the streets hadn't dismantled the organization. The structure had held, the loyalty had held, the communication had held, and in holding, it had handed investigators exactly what they needed to build a case that would survive every legal challenge thrown at it. The guilty pleas came eventually, but they didn't come clean. Roosevelt Daniels and several co-defendants entered guilty pleas while preserving a specific legal challenge, one that had nothing to do with whether cocaine had been sold, nothing to do with wiretaps, nothing to do with the witnesses. It was about the grand jury that had returned the original indictment. Their lawyers argued that the federal grand jury had already exceeded its legal term by the time it handed down the charges against Daniels. If that argument was correct, it meant the indictment itself was legally invalid, not procedurally unusual, not technically flawed, invalid, meaning it should never have existed. Think about what that would have meant. Years of investigation, thousands of hours of surveillance, phone monitoring, financial analysis, witness interviews, multiple arrests, all of it potentially undone not because the government couldn't prove its case, but because of a calendar, a date on a form, a technicality so procedural it sounds almost impossible to believe it could carry that much weight. But in federal court, it can, and for a period of time, there was genuine legal uncertainty about whether one of Chicago's biggest cocaine prosecutions could survive. The government argued the grand jury had been properly extended. Defense attorneys pushed back. The arguments went up through the federal courts, eventually reaching the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, the federal appeals court with jurisdiction over Chicago. The Seventh Circuit rejected the challenge, the indictment stood, the guilty pleas remained intact, and the case moved forward to the moment every federal defendant eventually faces: sentencing, There's nothing dramatic about a federal sentencing hearing, at least not on the surface. No audience, no music, just a judge, a defendant, defense attorneys, prosecutors, and a set of numbers that can determine what's left of a person's life. When Roosevelt Daniels was sentenced, the number that came down shocked experienced observers of federal criminal proceedings. 55 years, not a figure arrived at casually. The appellate record later described the offenses as brazen, far-flung, and enormously profitable. Language the Seventh Circuit used while also noting the extraordinary length of the prison term handed down to Daniels and his co-defendants. This wasn't a sentence designed to punish a drug dealer. This was a sentence designed to ensure that whoever Roosevelt Daniels had allegedly become, whatever role he had allegedly occupied at the center of this network, that role would never be rebuilt. Around him, 55 years in federal prison means something very specific. It means that whatever life exists outside those walls is effectively no longer yours. It means that the children who were young when you went in will be middle-aged by the time your sentence is theoretically complete. It means that the streets that once allegedly moved on your instruction will have gone through multiple generations of organization, reorganization, leadership, and collapse without you. It means the government won, but even that wasn't the end of the legal fight. After sentencing, Daniels continued challenging the case through the federal court system. He filed post-conviction motions arguing that serious legal errors had affected the prosecution. He raised claims involving the effectiveness of his legal representation, arguing that his counsel had not provided the level of assistance the Constitution requires. These are standard post-conviction arguments, and federal courts take them seriously enough to review them. The courts reviewed them, and in the end, the conviction remained. The sentence remained. Every major legal challenge that could be mounted against this prosecution was mounted, and every one of them was turned back. That fact deserves more attention than it usually gets when people tell the story of criminal cases. The trial itself, or in this case the guilty pleas, represents only one stage of the legal process. What comes after, the appeals, the post-conviction motions, the procedural challenges, is where many cases that seemed airtight actually unravel. Evidence gets suppressed on appeal. Sentencing guidelines get recalculated. Constitutional violations discovered years later result in convictions being vacated. None of that happened here. The government built a case strong enough to survive years of challenge from experienced defense attorneys. And that durability, that structural integrity of the prosecution itself, is part of why this case matters to people who study how federal law enforcement targeted organized crime in Chicago. During this era, while all of this was moving through the courts, Chicago itself kept moving. That's the other hard truth about cases like this one, the one that doesn't fit neatly into any narrative about law, enforcement, victory, or criminal consequence. Taking down one organization, even one as allegedly sophisticated as the network prosecutors described around Roosevelt Daniels, doesn't remove the conditions that allowed that organization to grow. The neighborhoods were still there. The poverty was still there. The demand for cocaine, the same demand the organization had allegedly built its fortune meeting, was still there. And wherever persistent demand exists in a market that the legitimate economy refuses to serve, someone eventually shows up to serve it. Different faces stepped in, different crews claimed different corners. A new generation came of age in the same communities, facing the same limited options, looking at the same streets and making the same calculations that investigators believed Daniels had made years before. The crack epidemic didn't end because one indictment was filed or one sentence was handed down. It deepened, it spread, It tore through entire family structures across Chicago's south and west sides in ways that are still visible decades later. That reality is not a criticism of the investigation. Federal law enforcement did what federal law enforcement does. They built a case, prosecuted it, and won. The agents who worked this case spent years on it, and by the government's own accounting, they dismantled a major criminal organization. But the system that produced that organization, and that produced the dozens of other organizations working the same streets at the same time, that system didn't get dismantled by an indictment. And that gap between what a federal prosecution can accomplish and what actually needed to change for these neighborhoods to be different is the shadow that falls over every case like this one. Roosevelt Daniels died in federal prison in April 1994. He had spent years fighting the conviction through the courts. He had raised every legal argument available to him. He had appealed, filed motions, challenged the process at every stage. None of it had worked, and when he died inside the same federal system that had arrested him, indicted him, convicted him, and sentenced him to what was effectively the rest of his life. There was no dramatic escape. There was no last-minute reversal. There was no final act in which the story turned into something other than what it was. A federal prosecution began. A man was convicted. He fought that conviction until he couldn't anymore, and then he died in custody. That's the ending, and somehow the plainness of it, the absence of any Hollywood moment, feels like the most honest thing about this entire story. Here is what makes Roosevelt Daniels different from most of the names that get discussed in Chicago organized crime history. He's not widely known. Outside of people who study federal drug prosecutions from this era, or people connected to the communities where his alleged network operated, the name Roosevelt Daniels doesn't carry the cultural weight of some of his contemporaries. He didn't become a legend. He didn't become a cautionary tale that got passed down through generations of street mythology. He didn't get a nickname that ended up on a documentary streaming somewhere. He got a 55-year sentence, a series of failed appeals, and a death in federal custody that left almost no public trace. Part of that anonymity is by design, or at least, it's the natural result of how federal prosecutions work compared to street-level notoriety. The people who become legends are usually the ones whose stories circulate orally, through neighborhoods, through the accounts of people who witnessed them firsthand, through the kind of reputation that moves faster than any court document. Federal cases produce paper records, court opinions, appellate decisions. Documents that sit in archives and get referenced by legal scholars and occasionally by journalists doing research. But there's something else here too. Something about the nature of what the government alleged Daniels had built that explains why his story didn't become mythology the way some other stories did. Organizations that survive because of one man's charisma, one man's street reputation, one man's willingness to personally involve himself in violence. Those organizations tend to produce stories. The man is visible, the man is the story. When that man falls, the story is ready, made. But according to prosecutors, what Daniels allegedly built was designed to not look like one man. The insulation was the point. The structure was the point. The fact that it allegedly kept running after his arrest was proof that it had been constructed to survive without his visible presence. You don't build something like that by making yourself the center of every story. You build it by creating systems that function even when you step back. That kind of discipline, if the allegations are accurate, is exactly why he's both historically significant and historically obscure. He was allegedly too good at what he did for the legend to form around him. The case of Roosevelt Daniels sits inside a much larger shift in how federal law enforcement approached organized crime during the 1980s and into the 1990s. For most of the previous decades, drug enforcement had operated on a relatively simple model: find dealers, arrest dealers, process dealers. The goal was removal, get this specific person off this specific corner. The problem with that model, which investigators understood intellectually but often struggled to operationalize, was that it didn't address the structure underneath. You remove one corner dealer and another one appears, often the next day, often trained by the person you just arrested. The federal government's response to that problem was RICO, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, and the broader shift toward conspiracy prosecutions that it represented. Instead of targeting individuals, federal prosecutors began targeting organizations. Instead of proving one transaction, they began proving patterns of behavior across time, across multiple defendants, across entire criminal enterprises. And instead of measuring success by individual arrests, they began measuring it by the number of people you could indict together, tried together, sentenced together, in a way that didn't just remove one person but theoretically broke the infrastructure that allowed the organization to function. The Daniels prosecution was part of that shift. The fact that the indictment included conspiracy charges, telephone facilitation charges, and racketeering-related offenses wasn't incidental. It reflected a deliberate prosecutorial strategy to build a case that connected multiple defendants to a single criminal enterprise, and to make the sentence reflect not just what one man had allegedly done, but what the organization he allegedly led had done. That's why the 55 years was so severe. That's why the appellate court's language about the offenses being brazen and far-flung matters. The sentence wasn't a response to one cocaine transaction. It was a response to an entire alleged enterprise, and it was calibrated to ensure that whatever remained of that enterprise couldn't be rebuilt around the same leadership. Whether that calibration was just, whether sentences of that length, handed down in that era, under those guidelines, represent the right response to what was alleged, is a question that federal sentencing reform advocates have been asking for decades. The mandatory minimum sentences and sentencing guidelines that produced results like 55 years for a drug conspiracy conviction were the same guidelines that drove mass incarceration in federal prisons throughout the 1990s and 2000s, and the same guidelines that Congress has been modifying and revisiting ever since. That debate extends far beyond Roosevelt Daniels, but his case is part of the evidence in that debate, one day, to point in the long, contentious argument about whether incapacitation at that scale produces the community outcomes it promised, or whether it simply moves the problem around while leaving the underlying conditions exactly as they were. What gets preserved when a case like this disappears from public memory? The court documents remain. Federal appellate opinions are public records, searchable, archived, available to anyone who knows where to look. The Seventh Circuit's decision in the Daniels case describes the offenses. It describes the jailhouse phone interceptions. It describes the legal challenges raised and rejected. It preserves, in legal language, the outline of what prosecutors alleged and what the courts found. But the texture of it, the lived experience of the communities where this allegedly happened, the perspective of the people who grew up on those streets during that era, the full human weight of what this case represented for everyone it touched, that doesn't live in court documents, that lives in memory, in oral history, in the kind of conversations that happen between people who were there and people who want to understand what it was actually like. That gap is part of why channels like this one exist, not to glorify what these men allegedly did, not to reframe convicted drug traffickers as heroes, but to document the full complexity of what happened in American cities during the crack era, to look at the federal cases, read the court records, understand the prosecution strategies, and put All of that inside the actual historical context of the communities that lived through it. Roosevelt Daniels allegedly built one of Chicago's most sophisticated cocaine networks during one of the city's most turbulent decades. He was arrested, tried through a guilty plea process, sentenced to 55 years. Fought that sentence through the courts until he had no more challenges left to raise, and died in federal prison. In 1994, that is a complete story. It doesn't need embellishment, and it doesn't need to be softened. What it needs is to be told. Every criminal organization tells itself the same story, that the money will never stop, that loyalty can't be bought away, that the operation is too smart, too deep, too disciplined to be touched. Federal prosecutors heard that story in the wire recordings. They heard it in the calls made from a jail cell by a man who allegedly believed that concrete walls and locked doors and armed guards were not sufficient obstacles for what he had built. And then they spent years in courtrooms proving that no organization, no matter how sophisticated the communication, no matter how loyal the associates, no matter how insulated the leadership is, immune to a patient, coordinated federal investigation. The streets rewarded power. The federal courts measured evidence. One of those measurements came back with a number, 55 years. And then one April morning in 1994, inside a federal correctional facility somewhere in the American prison system, Roosevelt Daniels died. The streets he had allegedly commanded kept moving without him. Chicago kept changing. The crack era eventually receded, replaced by new drugs and new networks and new federal investigations into new organizations built by new people facing the same impossible economics in the same underserved neighborhoods. The cycle continued. It always does. But for one man who allegedly convinced his organization that he couldn't be touched, who allegedly ran a cocaine network from inside federal custody on a phone, the government was already listening. The end came quietly. Inside the system he had reportedly believed he could outlast. The empire ended. The record remained, and somewhere in the federal archive, the transcripts of those jailhouse phone calls still exist. Evidence that even the most disciplined organizations have limits. Evidence that the most confident men in locked rooms are still in locked rooms. And evidence that whatever Roosevelt Daniels allegedly built, it wasn't enough not to beat the charges, not to survive the sentence, not to outlast the federal government's patience. This was Chicago's cocaine era. This was one of its biggest cases. And this is the story of the man at the center of it, told not the way the streets would tell it, but the way the federal record tells it, with all the weight that record carries.